Hello, everyone. Welcome to World Mythology. In this course, we examine myths from cultures all over the world. But before we begin, I'd like to introduce a few key concepts that are important for the academic study of myth. First, if we are to discuss myth, it is important to establish a definition. Now, I'd like to use a definition that I first found in a book on classical mythology by Richard Buxton. And Buxton defines myth as a socially important traditional story. So let's take that apart a little bit. The definition tells us that myths are traditional. So that is to say they come from a cultural tradition and they begin in the past, or they have their origin there. They're retold or reproduced, and then they're accepted as stories that help to define a culture and to give it identity. Now, Buxton also says myth is a socially important traditional story. So the socially important part of that definition is that myths are valued by both individuals and societies. They are connected to various elements of societies, like their values and their norms and their institutions. Myths are also stories. So they are accounts of people or characters and events. Now, if we look at definitions of myth that we might find on the internet, we may also see that sometimes they're defined as stories that are believed but may not be true. Well, if we're studying myth academically, then the question of whether we believe the stories or not, or whether they are true or untrue, is irrelevant for us. If we're using Buxton's definition, then it doesn't matter to us whether the myths are true or not. What matters, what's really important, is that they have been established through a tradition and that they are important to people. If stories are important to people, then they are worthy of study. Perhaps if we work to understand the stories of other peoples, other cultures around the world, then we'll begin to understand each other better. I'd like to make a few points about this idea of understanding and understanding each other better, or understanding the stories themselves. When it comes to learning about and understanding myth, there are three key points I'd like you to consider. The first is that in all cultures, myth originates from oral tradition. So stories were passed from person to person, or person to group, orally. For some cultures, this continues to be the case. And for others, myth was written down and sort of landed on various materials. Eventually, in some cultures, myth was written on paper and it became documents, or it became books. And in this course, we come to myths as they're written on paper. But the point that myth originated in oral tradition is important for several reasons. The first, is that it's important to recognize that myths remained in oral tradition, and myths that were written down maintained an equal value. So just because some myths weren't written down and some myths were, doesn't mean that some are more valuable than others. They all have equal value. Just because some myths were written down and others weren't, doesn't mean, for example, that some are more sophisticated than others. Again, this is not the case. They have equal value and are equally as sophisticated as each other. Also, what's important to consider is that myths that were maintained orally are embodied stories. That is to say that when the teller of the story passes on, dies, the story in that version passes too. And then the next teller of the myth adds their own interpretation of it, keeping it alive. In contrast, myths that were written down in some ways were written down by a specific person or a specific group of people, depending. Those myths became in some ways disembodied stories. So that is to say that we don't need the teller in order to approach the story, because the story has been documented in text. So in this case, stories become, as I say, disembodied texts. Yes, they become separate from the body and therefore separate and distanced from the original myth teller. This also means, though, that the myth is more mobile. Yes, so myths could move without the person who originally told them. Again, this not only creates distance between the teller and the myth itself, but it also creates distance between the text, the myth in written form, and its reader or its listener. So this is the first point, is that this distance is established. The second point I'd like to make is about language. Most of the time, when we are reading myths from other cultures, we are reading them in translation. So we're reading them, they originated in other languages, and then we read them in our own language, perhaps. This means that we are reading another person's interpretation of the myth. Now, certainly, translators do their best to capture the intricacies and the nuances of any story. And I think this is a really hard part of the job, I have to say. But as soon as meaning moves from one language to another language, it changes in essence. So, I mean, ideally, we would all read myths in their original languages, but this is just not possible for us. It's not possible for us to all speak and read all the languages of the world. So we read them in translation. But again, what happens here is that some distance develops between the myth itself, the myth teller, the myth itself, and the myth listener or reader. If we're reading a myth in text, so that's likely on paper or that's been documented, we have space that's created because it's not being brought to us orally. In addition to that, we have space that's created because we're not accessing it in its original language. Translation is a circumstance that brings about a complexity of voice. So on the one hand, it might be good for a culture stories to be shared in other languages so that people can come to have knowledge of the culture, access the culture, begin to access that culture's stories. And this can be a good thing. But on the other hand, when the myth is shared in another language, as I said before, some of the intricacies and the nuances of the meaning may be lost. So again, this creates this distance between the teller of the original myth and the reader or the listener. So, and as I say, it creates a kind of complexity of voice. So it's always important to ask questions about whose voice we're hearing when we read that myth and to take that into consideration. This also connects to my last point about the distance that's present between the myth teller and the listener or reader of the story. It's important to acknowledge that as we interpret the story as well, we bring our own knowledge, our own values, and our own cultural understanding along with that. Sometimes this is referred to as our position or positionality. Sometimes it's referred to as our lens, the lens that we may look through. Sometimes it's referred to as our worldview or even our point of view. Regardless of what we call it, recognizing that when we are connecting with stories from other cultures, there is much that we may not know and may not be able to understand is important. So this is why, and necessary. And this is why it's exceptionally important to be as open-minded as possible and to approach the stories with some humility. And of course, if we should ever happen to meet someone who is from the culture of the stories that we are reading, it's, I think, always good to ask questions and be open to the answers that come to us. Now, we can analyze myth from a number of different perspectives as well. So I've mentioned a few points for consideration in terms of myth, oral tradition, language and translation, as well as our own worldview or our own position. And now I think it's important to mention as well that we can look at myths from a variety of different perspectives and also a variety of different academic disciplines. So we may look at a myth from a psychological perspective, for example, and we might consider theories by psychologists like Sigmund Freud or C.G. Jung. We may examine myth from a historical perspective, and we might compare it to documented historical events that we are familiar with. We might look at myth as part of a culture, and we may then take an anthropological perspective when we examine it. Or we might examine myth from a sociological perspective and consider what it suggests about a society's social norms, perhaps family structures, and so on. We may also look at myth from a literary perspective and consider its style, its structure, its form, and it's the literary devices that are employed. I think a good starting point to use for examining myth is through the concepts of theme, motif, and archetype. We will discuss these at length in relation to many myths as the course progresses. So these are just a few introductory considerations I'd like to bring forward before we look at the myths in more detail. Overall, I think there is much to learn from world mythology, and I hope you enjoy the course.